I found my ex-husband's father abandoned in a nursing home. I kept coming back. 2 months later, on one of his clear days, he pressed an envelope into my hands. It changed everything and ended my ex-husband's carefully built lie. The voicemail was 12 seconds long. I know because I played it 4 times, standing in my kitchen at 6:47 in the morning in yesterday's clothes. And each time it ended, I stood there staring at the wall trying to decide what to do with what I'd just heard. Vanessa's voice. Smooth, the way marble is smooth, beautiful, and completely cold. 12 seconds. That's all it took to confirm everything Walter had tried to warn me about on his good days. Everything I'd half believed and half dismissed. Everything I'd watched Daniel maneuver around for 2 months with his careful smile and his patient explanations and his hand on my shoulder saying, "Claire, you don't understand the full picture." I understood the full picture now. I put the phone face down on the counter and stood very still until my hands stopped shaking. Then I picked it up, called Ethan Mercer, and said, "We have a problem, and I need you to hear something before anyone else does." This is how I got to that phone call. This is the whole story. I found Walter Hayes on a Tuesday in October, which was the last day I had any plans to be in that part of town. I'd been taking a different route to the farmer's market for 3 years, since the divorce, specifically to avoid the stretch of Millbrook Avenue where Daniel and I used to get coffee on Saturday mornings. 3 years of adding 8 minutes to a drive I'd been making my whole adult life, just to avoid a memory. That's what divorce does to your geography. It carves the city up into zones you can't enter anymore without something catching in your chest. That Tuesday, there was construction on my regular route. I got redirected, and redirected again. And then I was on Millbrook Avenue without meaning to be, and I was fine. I was handling it. And then I passed Sycamore Gardens Memory Care and saw the name on the sign and stopped. Because Daniel's father had gone to Sycamore Gardens. Daniel had told me 8 months ago in a brief text that felt like a news bulletin from a country I no longer lived in. Dad's in memory care now. Sycamore Gardens. It's what's best. I'd sent back, "I'm sorry. Is he okay?" No reply. I didn't pursue it. Walter and I had been close during the marriage. Genuinely close. The kind of in-law relationship that people describe as lucky. He'd walked me through fixing a leaky pipe in my first apartment. He'd called me on my birthday every year without being reminded. He'd come to my mother's funeral and held my hand during the service and didn't say anything, just held it, which was exactly right. When Daniel and I split, I lost Walter too. That was the math of it. You don't get to keep both halves. I sat in the turning lane outside Sycamore Gardens for a full minute, then I turned in. The nurse at the front desk told me Walter Hayes was in room 14. She had tired eyes and a name badge that said Rosa RN, and she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has seen too many empty chairs next to occupied beds. "Are you family?" she asked. I was his daughter-in-law. "We divorced." She typed something. "He doesn't get many visitors." It was what she said next that I've never been able to forget, because she didn't mean to say it. I could tell she hadn't meant to say it. It just came out, the way things do when you've been holding them too long. "He used to ask for you," she said softly. "In the beginning. He asked if Claire had come by." I had to look away for a moment. Room 14 was at the end of a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and something underneath it that I didn't want to identify. Walter was sitting in a vinyl chair by the window which overlooked a parking lot. Not a garden, not a courtyard. A parking lot with 3 dying junipers along the fence line. No flowers in the room, no family photos on the wall, a greeting card on the windowsill that had been there long enough to curl at the edges. Walter Hayes, who had ironed his own shirts until the day his hands got too stiff, who had polished his shoes every Sunday night, who had kept a vegetable garden so orderly it looked like a blueprint, was sitting in a paper-thin gown staring at nothing. I knocked on the open door. He turned, squinted. "Claire?" he said. The word came out like something he hadn't been sure still existed. My throat closed. "Hi, Walter." I stayed for 40 minutes. We talked about his garden. He remembered the garden clearly. Every plant, every row, the year the tomatoes came in late, and the year he'd tried growing peppers for the first time. He asked about my mother, and I told him she was well because she wasn't well. She'd been gone 4 years. But some things you don't correct. When I left, he grabbed my hand. "You came," he said. "I did. Will you?" He stopped. Started again. "I don't suppose." "Saturday," I said. "I'll come Saturday." I cried in my car for 10 minutes. Not from sadness exactly. From something more complicated. From the understanding that this man had asked for me in the beginning, and no one had told me, and I had been rerouting around Millbrook Avenue for 3 years while he sat in room 14 next to a parking lot asking if Claire had come by. I came back Saturday, and the Saturday after, and the Tuesday in between. I want to tell you who Walter Hayes was, because this story only makes sense if you understand what had been done to him. Walter was 78 years old, a retired structural engineer who had worked on bridges. Actual bridges, the kind that carry thousands of people across water every day. He had a mind like a filing cabinet, precise and organized, the kind of man who could recall the tensile specifications of a steel cable he'd last looked at in 1987. He was proud, not in an ugly way, but in the way of someone who had built things and knew their value. He did not ask for help easily. He did not complain. His wife Margaret had died 6 years before I found him in room 14. Daniel was their only child. The dementia had started 2 years ago, slowly. Some days clear, some days clouded, and the clouded days coming more frequently now. But here is what I learned, visiting him twice a week. The dementia did not touch everything. His character was intact. His dignity was intact. The thing that made him Walter was still completely there. Even on the days when the names and the dates slipped. What had been taken from him was not his mind. It was his context, his environment, his choice. He had been placed somewhere and left, and the somewhere he'd been placed had no garden view, no visitors, no Sunday shoe polish, no evidence whatsoever that the man inside the room had once built bridges. The fourth visit, he forgot about the divorce, asked if Daniel had fixed the loose deckboard at our old house. Not my deck anymore, I said. He looked at his hands. The shame on his face was unbearable. I'm sorry, he said. I taught him better. I know you did. He nodded slowly. Didn't say anything else. I started bringing things. A real wool blanket from a shop downtown. Navy blue, the color he used to wear. Warm socks. Fruit cut into pieces because his hands were stiff, and the ones the facility served came whole and sat untouched. A small framed photograph I found in storage. Walter standing in his garden the summer before Margaret died, squinting into the sun, enormously pleased with himself. I put it on the windowsill next to the curled greeting card. He didn't say anything when he saw it, just reached out and touched the frame once, very lightly. The warning came on a Thursday. He grabbed my wrist as I was standing to leave, and his grip was stronger than it should have been, stronger than anything I'd felt from him since the early visits. I turned and looked at his face. Clear, fully, completely clear, the way I'd seen him maybe 3 times since October. All the fog gone, his eyes sharp and present and knowing. Don't trust them, he said. My heart kicked hard. Walter? Daniel. He glanced at the door, quick and careful, the look of someone who had learned to be careful about doors. And her. Vanessa. Daniel's girlfriend. 2 years into something that had started, I was later told, while Daniel and I were still married. Tall, composed, the kind of beautiful that seems designed to make other people feel ungainly. I had met her exactly once, briefly, in a parking lot. It was not a warm meeting. Walter's hand tightened on my wrist. They didn't put me here because they had to, he said. The air in the room changed quality. Papers, he said. Signatures. They needed me out of the way. I wouldn't sign. Sign what? But the clarity was already going. I could see it happening, like watching a tide pull out, the sharp edges softening, the focus going loose. Claire, he said, in a different voice. The uncertain one. Were you leaving? I sat back down. Not yet, I said. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought about the word papers. Thought about what papers a man like Walter would refuse to sign. Thought about what Daniel would need badly enough to put his father in a memory care facility on Millbrook Avenue, and then stop visiting. Walter had been an engineer. Organized. Precise. He had owned property. The family home in Clarendon, 4 bedrooms, 2 acres, the house where Daniel grew up. He had savings I didn't know the extent of. He had a filing cabinet in his study that he'd kept locked and organized for 40 years. They needed me out of the way. I got up at 2 a.m. and started looking up elder law attorneys. I found Ethan Mercer through a referral from my own attorney, Patricia Haynes, 19 years in family law, the woman who had handled my divorce and whom I trusted completely. When I described what I suspected, Patricia said without hesitation, call Ethan, tonight if you can. Ethan Mercer had been practicing elder law for 16 years. He had a quiet office on Garrison Street, and the particular manner of someone who has heard terrible things so often that he no longer sounds surprised by them, but hasn't stopped being angry. He was 45, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of listener who makes you feel like every word is being filed away accurately. I told him everything. Walter's warning, the papers, the stopped visits, the facility. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk. What you're describing, he said, is common enough that I never call it surprising anymore. He paused. I call it what it is, though. Elder financial abuse. Specifically, if what Walter told you is accurate. Attempted coerced asset transfer from a vulnerable adult. Is that criminal? Potentially. But first, we need to establish what was being signed and what authority Daniel has claimed. He picked up a pen. Has Walter ever been declared legally incompetent? I don't know. That's the first thing we find out. If he hasn't, if there's no court-ordered guardianship or conservatorship, then Daniel's authority over his affairs may be entirely self-appointed, which means whatever he's been doing with Walter's finances, his property, his medical decisions, all of it is potentially unauthorized. I drove home with a legal pad full of notes and the first real sense of direction I'd had since October. 2 days later, I came to Sycamore Gardens early. I heard Daniel's voice before I reached the room. Low, controlled. The voice he used when he was angry but needed to appear patient. I knew that voice intimately. I'd been on the wrong end of it for 3 years of marriage. Just sign it, Dad. You won't even remember this tomorrow. I stopped walking. Vanessa, from somewhere to the right. You don't need to understand. That's the whole point. I pushed open the door. Daniel's face did something complicated. A flash of something I can only describe as exposure, quickly sealed over with the pleasant, reasonable expression I'd spent years learning to read underneath. Claire, what are you doing here? Vanessa looked up from her phone. Still dramatic. I looked at the papers in Daniel's hand. A document, several pages, a pen clipped to the top. Visiting someone you forgot existed, I said. I turned to Walter. He was sitting up in the chair, the papers in front of him, a confused expression on his face that I now recognized, not the dementia confusion, but the confusion of someone being pushed through a process they don't understand and aren't being allowed to question. Do you know what those papers are? I asked him. He looked at Daniel, then at me. No, he said. Then he's not signing anything. Daniel's pleasant expression dropped, just for a moment, like a mask on a loose string. You have no standing here. You're not family. I'm the person who's been visiting your father twice a week for 2 months while you've been doing whatever this is. I looked at the papers again. What are those, Daniel? A power of attorney Attorney revision. Routine. Routine. I let the word sit there. A routine document you're having him sign while telling him he won't remember it tomorrow. The room went quiet in a specific way. The quality of quiet that happens when something true has been said out loud and no amount of maneuvering can unsay it. Vanessa stood up. I think you should leave. I'll be back tomorrow, I said to Walter. Don't bother, Daniel said. Oh, I said quietly. I will. I called Ethan from the parking lot. They were in the room, document in hand. He told his father he wouldn't remember signing it tomorrow. Silence on Ethan's end, the productive kind. I need you to get me the name of Walter's attending physician at that facility, he said, and I need you to find out if there's been any cognitive assessment done in the last 6 months. How do I do that? You ask the nurse directly. You have a relationship with the staff. Use it. Rosa was at the nurse's station. I asked her quietly whether Walter had had a formal cognitive assessment recently. She looked at me for a long moment. The last one was 14 months ago, she said, when he was admitted. Has anyone requested an updated one? His son requested we hold off. He said Walter found them distressing. I wrote that down. Rosa, I said carefully, if someone wanted to ensure Walter's rights were protected, formally, what would that look like? She glanced down the corridor, then back at me. It would look like what you're already doing, she said, but with a lawyer. I was back the next afternoon with Ethan Mercer. He carried a leather portfolio and an expression of complete professional calm. I carried something I couldn't name that felt like Yuri dressed in a navy cardigan. Daniel was already there. He'd clearly come early, anticipating, maybe, that I would. He had Vanessa with him and a second document I hadn't seen before, and when he saw Ethan, he did the thing people do when they've been operating with impunity and suddenly encounter a formal obstacle. He went very still. What is this? Someone, I said, who can explain what those papers actually mean. Vanessa looked at Ethan. You brought a lawyer. I brought a witness. Ethan introduced himself, full name, credentials, practice area, in the measured way of someone who knows that clarity is its own form of authority. Then he turned to Walter and asked him, directly and gently, whether he would like anything explained to him before signing any documents. Daniel stepped forward. We are his family. We make decisions. Ethan didn't look at Daniel. He kept his eyes on Walter. Walter looked at Daniel, then at the papers, then at me, and in a voice thin but absolutely clear, he said, yes. He pushed the papers away with the heel of his hand. I don't sign things I don't understand. The room was completely still. Then Daniel's hand came down on the side table with a crack that made Walter flinch. After everything I've done for you? Walter looked at his son for a long moment. The look of a man who has finally reached the end of something, who has waited and hoped and extended the benefit of the doubt until there is no doubt left to give benefit to. You didn't do it for me, he said quietly. You did it for yourself. I had to look at the window. Ethan, completely unruffled, opened his portfolio and began explaining what Walter's actual legal rights were. What authority Daniel had claimed. What authority he actually possessed.
The distinction, as Ethan laid it out in plain language, was significant. Daniel had no formal guardianship, no court-appointed conservatorship. The power of attorney he'd been operating under was a document Walter had signed 4 years ago, before the dementia diagnosis, under circumstances that were now worth examining carefully. What does that mean? Daniel said. His voice was different now, tighter. It means, Ethan said, that any decisions made on your father's behalf over the past 2 years, without formal legal authority and without his informed consent, may be subject to review. He closed the portfolio. I'd recommend you retain an attorney. 3 days later, Louise Parker arrived at Sycamore Gardens. Louise was 70 years old, a senior elder law litigator with 34 years of practice, the kind of woman who wore a navy suit like armor and spoke in a courtroom voice even in small rooms. Ethan had referred her. She was, he said, the person you called when it moved past consultation into action. She had reviewed everything. Walter's original power of attorney, the documents Daniel had been attempting to have him sign, the facility's records showing the last cognitive assessment, Rosa's notes, which Louise had obtained through proper channels after a conversation with Sycamore Gardens administrator that I was not present for but heard described as brief and unambiguous. The documents Daniel had been presenting for Walter's signature were, as Louise explained to me, a revision to the power of attorney that would have given Daniel and Vanessa joint control over Walter's assets, including the Clarendon house, valued at approximately $680,000, with minimal oversight requirements and no provision for Walter's personal care expenses. He was trying to lock up the estate, Louise said, while his father was still alive, and he was trying to do it in a facility where his father has documented cognitive fluctuations, using a document his father clearly didn't understand, after telling facility staff to delay cognitive assessments. I sat with that for a moment. Is that criminal? It meets the threshold for elder financial abuse under state statute, she said. Whether it becomes a criminal matter depends on what a forensic review of Walter's accounts shows. She looked at me steadily. Has Walter given any indication of other transactions? Anything that's already occurred? He had. In one of his clearest recent conversations, 2 weeks before Louise arrived, Walter had told me about a savings account. He'd described it carefully. A specific bank, a specific amount, roughly $140,000 he'd kept separate since Margaret died. Money he described as for emergencies and for whoever needs it when I'm gone. He'd checked it last, he said, 8 months ago, before Sycamore Gardens. It was short, he said. I told Daniel. He said he'd look into it. I had written that down too. Louise's forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, CPA, 12 years in financial elder abuse cases, filed a formal request for
Walter's bank records within 48 hours. What she found in those records, 10 days later, was not a mystery. 2 transfers, 14 months ago and 11 months ago, each one $28,000. Recipient account registered to a Shell LLC that Louise's team traced in 4 days to Vanessa, $56,000. While Walter was in Sycamore Gardens, while Daniel was telling church friends Walter didn't want visitors. I was in Walter's room when Daniel arrived to find out what had been done. Louise was there. Ethan was there. I was there in the corner, holding a cup of tea I'd stopped drinking, watching. Daniel came in fast, face tight in a way I recognized. The way he looked when something was happening that he couldn't control and hadn't anticipated. He'd spent a lifetime being the person in the room with the most information. He was not that person today. You had no right, he said to Louise. You manipulated him. He doesn't understand what he's agreeing to. Louise didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. I represented your father during multiple verified lucid periods, documented by Rosa Gutierrez, RN, and Dr. Carl Obasi, your father's attending physician, both of whom were present and attesting. She picked up a single sheet from her portfolio and held it toward him. What I filed today formally revokes any and all authority you have claimed over Walter Hayes, pending a court-supervised competency review. His accounts have been frozen pending the financial investigation, and the facility has been instructed that your access is restricted to scheduled supervised visits until further notice. Daniel stared at the paper. His access, Louise said, gone. His control, gone. He looked at me. He was shaking now, not from grief. From the specific fury of someone watching something they believed was secured, simply stop being theirs. You did this, he said. Walter answered before I could. He was sitting up in his chair, the navy blanket across his lap, the photograph of his garden on the windowsill behind him. He looked at his son with the clear eyes I'd come to recognize as his truest ones. No, he said. I did. Daniel left without another word. The door swung shut. Louise made a note in her portfolio. Ethan looked at me. There'll be a hearing, he said quietly. It won't be fast, but it'll be right. That should have been the end of the crisis portion. It wasn't. The next morning, 6:47 a.m., a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. She didn't say hello. Whatever you think you've done, Vanessa said, understand that he has documentation of everything, including you, the visits, the gifts, what you've been saying to him. He has a record, Claire. And when this goes to court, the story of an obsessive ex-wife who manipulated a vulnerable old man is going to be very easy to tell. Back away, or we tell it. 12 seconds. I played it 3 more times standing in my kitchen. Then I called Ethan. She left a voicemail, I said. I need you to hear it before anyone else does. He listened to it once. Send it to me right now, he said. Do not delete it. Do not respond to her. Do not contact Daniel. A pause. Claire, this is the best thing that could have happened. A threat is the best thing? A recorded threat made by the subject of a financial abuse investigation to a witness in that investigation is not just a threat, he said. It's evidence. Louise filed it as Exhibit F. The financial abuse case moved to the county DA's office in February. I was told by Ethan, in the careful language attorneys use when they want to be accurate without promising anything, that the case was progressing in a direction consistent with accountability. What I know for certain, Daniel's access to Walter's accounts was formally revoked. The $56,000 in transfers became part of a civil recovery action. The Clarendon house, which Walter, in a lucid session with Louise and Dr. Obasi, confirmed he had never intended to transfer, remained in Walter's name, with Louise's firm acting as representative. Vanessa's voicemail did not stay private. It became, as these things do, something that people knew about. I don't know exactly how. I suspect Megan, actually, but that's unverifiable. What I know is that by March, Daniel had lost the pleasant, reasonable story he'd told about himself, the devoted son, the responsible one, the person managing a difficult situation with grace. That story requires an audience willing to believe it, and the audience had stopped being willing. Walter had good days and bad days. That didn't change. The dementia was real. That was never the fabrication. What was fabricated was everything built around it. On a Thursday in March, a clear day, he called me to his chair and pressed an envelope into my hands. It was sealed. My name on the front in his careful engineer's handwriting. I had Rosa help me, he said, on a good day, a few weeks ago. I looked at it. You don't have to open it now, he said. I opened it then, sitting in the vinyl chair next to his, in the room that now had 2 framed photographs and a real blanket and a small potted plant on the windowsill. Inside was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, and a legal document I recognized as a copy of his updated will, drawn up with Louise's firm, witnessed, notarized, court-filed. I read the letter first. Claire, you came back when you didn't have to. That tells me everything I need to know about why Margaret loved you. I was a proud man. I'm still a proud man. I want you to know that I understood more than they thought I did. I knew what Daniel was doing. I knew I couldn't stop it alone. You stopped it. I want you to know that I know that. I'm leaving the garden tools to you. I know that's a strange thing, but you're the only one who ever asked about the garden like it mattered. It does matter. Things you grow yourself always do. I want you to have something real from me. Not because of the legal business. Because you came back. Your friend, Walter. I sat in that room for a long time after I finished reading. Walter had drifted off in his chair, the navy blanket across his lap, the afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that didn't show the parking lot, just the sky, pale blue and ordinary and very large. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope. In the end, it wasn't the $680,000 house or the recovered $56,000 or the legal proceedings or the DA's case that mattered most. It was this, a 2-page letter from a proud old man who had built bridges his whole life and knew how to tell the difference between what held weight and what didn't. He knew the difference. He always had. That's what they'd underestimated, both of them. They'd looked at an old man in a thin gown by a parking lot window and seen something diminished, something manageable, something that could be processed and signed and filed away. They hadn't seen Walter. I tucked the envelope into my bag, said goodbye to Rosa on my way out, and drove home in the early March dark. The garden tools arrived 2 weeks after Walter passed in June, packed carefully in a wooden crate, each one wrapped in cloth the way he used to wrap them for winter storage. I planted tomatoes that August. First time I'd grown anything in years. They came in late. Walter would have found that very funny.